Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. There is far too much COVID-19 misinformation out there on the internet. So today we're doing something a little different here. With me today as my guest here on Progressive Profiles is Dr. Dan Wilson of the YouTube channel Debunk the Funk. So, Dr. Wilson, please tell us a little bit about who you are and what your channel's all about.
Hello. Yeah. So my name's Dr. Wilson, otherwise you can call me Dan. Um, but I am just a regular scientist. I have my PhD in molecular biology, and in my spare time, aside from my day job, I run my YouTube channel, Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson, where I debunk anti-vaccine and COVID misinformation. Um, and yeah, that's been a fun hobby for me essentially for the past
You
um
find dealing with
over
all
two
this
years.
misinformation fun.
In a way, yeah, I do.
All right, well, we're definitely going to come back to that. All right, but yeah, sorry, please continue.
Oh, it's fine. I was just saying I'd been doing that for a little more than 2 years now, and I don't plan on stopping anytime soon.
Sadly, I think yeah, you'll need to be debunking a lot more of the funk out here. But first, let's talk a little bit about you, and then we'll get into the channel and everything about all the problems with COVID misinformation. You said you were a molecular biologist. I'm pretty
hmm
scientifically illiterate in a great many ways. So what does that entail, being a molecular biologist?
Sure. Yeah. So most people might know the term microbiologist,
Mm-hmm.
where those scientists would mostly be working with bacteria or fungi, usually in like a infectious disease setting, studying the bacteria and uh, funguses that make us sick. But molecular biology is a little more broad, where in molecular biology, we're trying to determine the fundamental aspects of how molecules work in life. So, like if I'm a molecular biologist and I want to study how a certain protein works and how it makes the cell do a specific job, then you're a molecular biologist. So that's the kind of thing that um, you would do, just in general, broad terms.
Okay. So if I have it right in my head, um, microbiology is about studying the actual like individual living like maybe single cell or like slightly multi-cell organisms, whereas molecular biology is about what makes them tick and how like they interact with each other.
Yeah, and the two fields can definitely overlap a lot. But yeah, in microbiology, they would typically be focusing more on like a an organismal level, like how a bacteria might interact with its host or how a bacteria might interact with other bacteria. Whereas in molecular biology, it's a little bit more narrow focused in figuring out how the molecules themselves work.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good to know. So then what made you want to become a molecular biologist? Like how did that happen?
So it was not a very direct road. I kind of went into college thinking, knowing that I wanted to study biology, but I thought I wanted to be a zoologist. I loved
Oh.
animals and all that.
Do you
The
still love
cell,
animals though? That the way you imply that's like
of
no
course.
relationship with animals done.
Yes, I have a picture of dogs in my background, so yes, I love animals. Um, no, but I wanted to study them, and the cellular and molecular aspect of biology always was more difficult to me. But in college, something kind of clicked, and that's what I did almost exclusively.
Hmm.
And then my advisor that I had in college was really great. He was awesome, um, and we became good friends. And he was like, "You should get your PhD." And I was like, "What's that?" Because I didn't know the track. I knew I'm gonna get my college degree, and then who knows what's next. But then he was like, "You should get your PhD." And so I did some summer internships where I did research. I liked it. I kept doing research um, with my advisor. I really liked it, and so I just decided that's what I was going to do. I was going to go get my PhD in a molecular biology field and uh, pursue that passion. So that's what ended up happening. Just kind of fell into it and ran with it.
Okay. So then, like a slight follow up is like, what then turned you to biology as a kid? Were you just playing outside and you've realized the world is full of natural wonder, or is that
Mm.
just that was it? Okay.
Oh, well, no. So my mom is a she was a environmental scientist. She's retired now, but she would take me out to streams and we would like do field activities where we would do what's called kick netting, where we would basically like kick up the mud in a stream and use a net to capture all the stuff that comes up and then look at the stuff to assess the health of the stream. That kind of thing. Um, so my mom uh, was was a scientist for her job, and my dad was an educator for his job. Um, and so they both really instilled, a lot of curiosity in me, a lot of uh, appreciation for education, and I loved Animal Planet. I watched Animal Planet all the time. I thought science was so cool. I just didn't understand it when I was a kid, so I wanted to understand it, and I think that um, when I started to, then I really started to fall in love with it as a profession to pursue.
Oh well, unfortunately, I'm kind of the opposite. I actually grew up really liking science from the beginning. Like the little like test kits and stuff. Like I had a little
Hmm.
microscope. I would look at stuff under it. But then in high school, it got more and more difficult. And in grade 10, I had the worst science teacher because like how chemistry works, like with the numbers and values on it, it just did not click with me for the longest time. And I was trying to get him to help me because it's like, you're the teacher here, fucking help me. And he did not. And I had to go to summer school, and there that teacher finally got it with me. But unfortunately, my high school, this is like the only science teacher we would have moving forward. And so because of that alone, I was like, no, like basically this is where my scientific journey ends, unfortunately.
Mm,
But I've
yeah,
still always been
that's
open and receptive to science and learning. But of course, now it's no longer something that I'm, as passionate or informed or capable of as I used to be.
I see.
Which, yeah,
Yeah,
it
that's
sucks, but
really
that's what
unfortunate.
bad teachers do, right?
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. And I had a similar experience when I was in grade school. I think grade nine, I had a terrible biology teacher. Awful. I almost failed the class.
Let's see, I
Um,
actually failed grade 10 science.
I was literally like less than a percentage point away from failing the course. But
Wow.
then later, that teacher was found to like be doing some shady stuff with other people's grades. So yeah, not a great person. Uh,
Jeez.
but then, but then in like grade 12, and after that, I was like, never mind. I don't want to be a scientist. I can't do this. But then in grade 12, for some reason, I decided to take an AP biology course, and that teacher was awesome. He was one of my favorite teachers I've ever had. And he would have this thing in class where we'd have these like roundtable discussions, just the teacher and some high school kids about current events relevant to like biology.
Hmm.
I thought that was so cool to like, talk about these issues with us. And he would also do things where he's like, so at the end of the course, there are going to be a few lectures where I don't have stuff planned, and you guys can pick the topics if you want. You can
Hmm.
pick anything. And so we would pick topics that we're interested in. He would make lectures based on what we picked. Great teacher.
Yeah,
Totally
that
turned around my interest in science. So
it shows that all it takes is one good teacher to make a difference.
it really does. Yeah.
And that's also good of them to actually kind of allow for more like voluntary class engagement as well. I think that's actually really great of that teacher. As I was sort of saying earlier about like science, and unfortunately kind of had to stop in grade 10 because like I was not going to put up with that teacher, and I just knew it would be way too much of an uphill struggle. One thing that I have noticed over the years is that there's a lot of people out there, like me and also like others who where it just didn't click for them at all for whatever reason. There's a lot of scientific apathy, or perhaps you can call it scientific illiteracy, that's out there. And so, unfortunately, that brings us to the sort of core of the problem that we're about to talk to, which is all this COVID-19 misinformation. Um, and one of the big things, and maybe you can corroborate this, maybe it's different because I'm speaking, of course, as a Canadian from a Canadian perspective, but one of the biggest things that I've seen up here is a lot of kind of existing anti-vax forces that were before rightfully ridiculed for just being like, even most people, whether they were scientifically literate or not, were like, that's ridiculous, that's extreme. But then the pandemic happened, and then the movement just completely changed and exploded. And
Mhm.
I don't know why. Like, out of curiosity, and like, I know like we're just kind of spitballing this, but what do you think is the driving cause that allowed for something that was initially just so rightfully derided to suddenly become this massive global opposing force?
Yeah. So I've thought about that, and the way I have made sense of that in my head is kind of looking at it in a historical context. So looking at when new diseases have emerged in the past, kind of what happened. Um, and interestingly, if you look at um, HIV/AIDS, that pandemic, that emergence, there was a lot of misinformation surrounding that. A lot of denial too. Denial that, HIV is a virus that only infects certain kinds of people. Oh, it only infects gay people. Oh, it only infects gay black people. Oh, it only infects drug users. But it took a while for people to realize, for the general public to realize, like, okay, this is something that is going to affect everybody. And I think the reason it took a long time for people to accept that is kind of the same reason that that we see a lot of misinformation with COVID. It's because it affects so many different aspects of society. So with HIV, you had a virus that affected sexuality. It affected race, because people thought that um, only black people could get it for a time. It was associated with Haitians. Um, it was affected with drug use. Uh, Children could get it. And so, and it was causing a lot of death, a lot of suffering. So people reacted to it, and there was a political reaction to it as well. And when all of those forces kind of come together, it creates a very ripe environment, I think, for conspiracy theorists to enter a very complex and scary situation and offer simple and comforting answers, even though they're wrong.
Mm.
So with COVID, we had a new virus emerge that rapidly spread across the world, and we had to do things that modern society had never seen before. People had to stay indoors. Well, they had to social distance, not just stay indoors. People could go outside, but uh, they had to change their behavior. We had to say, okay, we can't gather anymore. Uh,
But
and
again, how effective was that, given a lot of people just didn't agree with that? And certain governments were like, yeah, we'll do a lockdown, but it was like barely a lockdown, right? Like there's
True.
obviously a lot to that as well that,
Yes,
didn't really help. But yeah, it was
yeah,
like
but
monumentous in changing.
right. But I think the point is that there was a large shift in the norm, in the day to day, in what's comfortable. There was also a very large political reaction to it, obviously, because politicians had to get involved in supporting these policies of whether or not to socially distance, whether or not to mask, and all that. So once all of those things, I think, became a part of COVID, then conspiracy theorists could come in, and you could have the maskers and the anti-maskers. You could have the people who, understood that it was important to socially distance and change your behavior, and the people who wanted to maintain freedom, uh, or whatever.
Freedom.
So,
Yeah, it's
yeah, I think you have a situation where things were complex, things were uncertain, things were scary, and people don't like to be uncertain. People don't like to be in the unknown. And unfortunately, there was just a lot of unknown at the beginning of COVID. So when conspiracy theorists can come in and offer those simple and comforting answers that are wrong, people will think that those answers are attractive and they may gravitate towards them, especially if there's political will behind them. And it did become so politicized as we know, as we still see.
Yeah, which
So
is deeply infuriating, but
yeah.
yeah.
So so I
So
think that those reasons are kind of why people like, Del Bigtree, who was typically seen as a stupid anti-vaxxer, and rightly so, has been able to work his way into bigger circles thanks to COVID. Uh, yeah, when things affect large parts of society and there's political will behind them, you're bound to have conspiracy theories that latch onto a lot of people.
yeah, what's just also especially disturbing though is that large parties, sure there were some fringe parties that adopted it, and most of the parties were sensible in different corners of the world. But then in places like here in Canada and in the United States, major opposition parties just latched onto it as well, which is so deeply concerning. But
Mhm.
during your explanation there, which thank you by the way, I think that is a very good way of explaining it. You also mentioned that it's a new virus, but unfortunately, like I said, we're here to kind of unfortunately do what a lot of you do on your channel, which is debunking some of this. There's a lot of people out there who say that no, this isn't some new virus, and either they say that it was deliberately created for like some conspiratorial reason in a lab, either in China, or like there was one that kind of made a conspiracy about it here in Canada, in the city of Winnipeg, in the prairies. And there's
Mm.
also lots of people who say it's not a new virus, it's just the flu. They're just trying to make you scared so that they can really solidify power. Like, now I know that it's not the flu, it's a cardiovascular disease that also breaks the blood barrier in the brain. But what do you think might be a more effective way of getting people to realize that no, this isn't just the flu? Like, what would you say? What would you offer to them to kind of gently show that this is a new virus and it should be taken seriously?
So, as a scientist, I would immediately think about the virus itself and how we characterize viruses. And the way we characterize viruses, right away shows, yes, this is a new virus that we have not seen before. Um, and I like to think that most people get that, but I'll just explain real quickly that yes, it's a coronavirus, which is a family of viruses that we have known about for a long time that includes viruses that cause the common cold. It also includes viruses like SARS-1 and MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory viruses, which are both very serious coronaviruses that we've seen in the past that can be
Yeah,
very
we had
deadly.
scares of them here in Canada back in the day.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, SARS-1, yeah, a lot of those cases were in Canada.
Yeah,
Um,
in the Toronto area, if I recall correctly. But yeah,
yes. Yes. So SARS-2 is another new virus. It's in the coronavirus family, but its genome is very different from previous coronaviruses that we have seen. So it's going to have new properties. Um, and, at the beginning, we didn't know what those properties were going to be exactly. We didn't know exactly how deadly it was going to be. We didn't know how far it was going to spread. But now, to the average person who says it's just the flu, um, the first thing that I go to is I will show them excess death figures. So every year, deaths nationwide, worldwide, are recorded and plotted over time. And so we basically can have a baseline average based on the previous 5 years. So in the years before 2020, nothing really groundbreaking happened that should affect those death numbers too much, right? So we should have a pretty stable baseline. But then once 2020, 2021, come around and COVID is spreading rapidly, causing lots of hospitalizations, causing lots of death, lots of suffering and illness, we can see pretty clearly that a lot more people were dying in those years than in any previous year before that. So the flu, if it's just the flu, it doesn't, it, you're not going to see that. You should see a normal looking year with a normal looking flu season. But since it's a new virus that our immune systems have not seen before, that can cause damage to a certain percentage of people that it infects, then we see these spikes in excess deaths.
Right. Makes
And
sense.
and so that is a really easy visual way to distinguish SARS-CoV-2 from something like the flu. It's not just any old virus that we see year to year. It's something new. It's caused millions of deaths worldwide. And
It's caused a million in
um,
America alone. It's wild.
yeah, yeah, and those numbers are way above what we would normally see in any given year. Those are all people who would have lived had it not been for this virus. So it's very, I think, ignorant and just close-minded and so many other things to say that it's just the flu.
Right. But also, unfortunately, to your point about the numbers and going higher, I remember people were trying to find all kinds of excuses for that. Right. It's like, oh no, they actually died of a heart attack, but because they had COVID in their system, they're saying that they died of COVID, which is just like that feels kind of like a semantics argument at that point in terms of,
Mhm.
hey, if you were hospitalized for COVID or COVID worsened a pre-existing condition, that's kind of on the new novel virus rather than the pre-existing condition where you may have had, sure, it might have been only a few more years if it was like a terminal condition or something, but like I feel like, it would have been different. I remember that being deeply frustrating. But in your response,
Yeah.
you touched on about, our immune systems and like immunity and stuff like that. So, one of the other things that happened early on with this virus was a lot of people, terrible people, I might add, saying, just let it rip, which unfortunately seems we're kind of doing now. But, just let it rip and we'll get herd immunity. And I remember seeing some stuff saying, here's why, we can't actually get herd immunity, but it was often either behind paywalls or something like that. Can you
Mm.
very quickly for us explain why herd immunity is not really possible with this virus and also just with a novel virus in general?
Yeah, so the problem with the let it rip and then we'll get herd immunity idea is that no virus has ever been dealt with successfully that way. Um, because what you get when that happens is the virus will rip through the population and you'll see a large, spike in cases. And along with all those cases, you have all the hospitalizations and deaths and
Mm-hmm.
other illnesses and suffering that come with it. And then as the population immunity increases, you're gonna see that decrease. So you'll have a wave. Um, but then what happens is that wave doesn't affect everybody, of course. Um, and then with travel and lowering antibody levels and new people becoming susceptible, you have the susceptible population steadily growing until the virus is able to have another wave. And that will continue. So you'll keep dealing with waves of this virus. And with wave after wave comes more hospitalizations, more deaths. It's the same thing that we saw with measles, which is a respiratory virus that is actually the most infectious virus that we know of. It's super, super infectious. It spreads really easily. And that's the same pattern we saw. It didn't just go away because people were getting infected with it. It only went away when we were able to vaccinate against it. And it's still not fully gone. It still exists in
Yeah,
certain
like I keep
populations
hearing
around
occasionally
the
of
world.
like measles outbreaks in certain areas of like the UK, America.
Hmm.
I remember for a while when it was like slow news days, they talk about, oh, be alarmed, rise in measles cases in Canada or something like that, right? But obviously that's all kind of gone to the wayside because of the big, life changing pandemic that happened.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And it's always in pockets of unvaccinated people that those infections and outbreaks pop up. Um, but the other thing, so this is all kind of dependent on the virus. When I talk about these situations, it's not going to apply to every single virus. There are always exceptions in biology. Nothing is ever just straightforward black and white. But when it came to SARS-CoV-2, there were aspects about coronavirus biology in general that we knew before SARS-CoV-2 came along that gave us a pretty good idea as to why that let it rip strategy was even dumber than what I just
yeah,
explained.
it'd be a terrible
Um,
idea.
yeah,
Um,
because coronaviruses, they always reinfect, right? And we see that now because it's an aspect of coronavirus biology that we knew. Um, what happens is you get infected, you get um, an immune response, you get antibodies, and then you are protected from infection for a certain period of time. But those antibody levels are always going to contract. Your immune system's not going to continue spending energy producing those high levels of antibodies all the time. So
Yeah,
those
that's
levels
that's
come
that's a
down.
lot. That's a lot of work and effort for the body. The body is ultimately lazy, wants to be efficient in as many ways as possible.
Right. So once those antibody levels decrease, you still have immune memory. Your immune cells remember encountering the pathogen, in this case, SARS-CoV-2. But it's not producing those high levels of antibodies. So you could become infected again. And now, if it's a year later and we have a new variant that has sufficiently mutated such that it can avoid uh, those antibodies that you have generated before, then it's going to be able to infect you more easily and potentially be more likely to cause severe disease. So that's what we saw with Omicron. It's able to avoid uh, antibodies that were generated from previous infections. But I'm sure we'll get into this conversation later that um, it doesn't happen with vaccination with 3 doses.
Yeah, well, speaking of, actually, that was going to be one of my questions, so I may as well ask it now. I am, quote, fully vaxxed, which is a term I genuinely dislike.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured you'd be of the same mind of that. But we are also seeing and hearing at least a little bit here in Canada about people being eligible for their fourth dose. Right now, it's really just the most at risk and our seniors, and then I think like they've opened it up to like people like aged 50 and over being next or something like that. And then it's just kind of a general 6 months after your third dose, you should get your fourth dose, I think is what the last update said. So that's about where I am now. I got my third like around Christmas time or like early New Year's or something like that. So yeah, like what? So what? Third dose, fourth dose, fifth maybe? Like what is kind of the like? And I don't want to say what's good enough, but like what is safe and proper, and potentially where does this likely end in terms of numbered doses?
Yeah, so those things are hard to predict,
I know it's a bit of a
to be
loaded
honest,
question.
but I think that as the data stand now, 3 doses is best. Um, a fourth dose for most people seems unnecessary, according to the data. It looks like a fourth dose doesn't really provide too much benefit. Um, so it looks like So basically, when you get another vaccination, the question as a scientist that I ask is, okay, what's it doing for me? And what's it doing for my immune system? Is it going to improve my memory response? Is it going to allow me to respond to future variants better than I am right now? Or is it just going to give me a boost of antibodies for like 4 to 6 months, and then that's it? Uh, and I think that the data for the fourth dose right now, it's unclear whether or not it actually boosts memory enough to justify recommending it to everybody. But what it does do is it does boost your antibody level. So that's why it's only being recommended to the most at-risk people,
Right.
because if they have that frontline defense of lots of antibodies, then that's what's most likely going to protect them from that initial infection, right? It's going to stop the virus before it even replicates. So instead of having a low antibody levels in your blood, and the virus is able to infect you, it starts replicating, and then your body remembers it, sees it, and eliminates it quickly, which is what happens, which is a reasonable, good goal for vaccination to reach, where you have that immune memory, you're able to clear the virus quickly before you have severe disease. Um, you know, someone who's older and more at risk might not be able to do that as easily. Their bodies
Right.
just might not be able to handle it. So preventing that infection might make sense. Uh, you know, I have family members in their 70s and they're getting their fourth dose, and it's like, yeah, as the scientist in me wants to be like, oh, but what's it really doing for you? But then I have to just think, okay, it's better to be safe than sorry, honestly, in that situation, because, you know, there's little risk to it, and it does give you that boost of antibodies that's
Oh
going
no!
to.
Don't you know the vaccine's full of poison? I guess.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry.
Yeah.
Dang those
No.
poisons. Maybe
Yeah.
not. Maybe they no, no.
I mean,
But
I've apparently had 3 doses of poison and I'm fine. So if
oh yeah, I
it's
get
clearly not as potent a poison as alcohol. But
no, yeah.
so then, like, for example, I have an aunt of mine, and she is immune compromised. So she, of
Hmm.
course, has been very careful during this pandemic. And since I'm in her bubble, as have I, it's why I'm still masking up these days.
Yeah.
Um, but like, so in her case, like, yeah, she's trying to get her fourth dose, and that's probably recommended because more at risk. Does that mean those of us who are adjacent to at risk people in this of safety, should we get a fourth dose, or still, because like I'm relatively fit and fine, I should be fine with the fully vaccinated 3 doses that I have so far?
I would think that it's probably okay for you to just wear a mask and be careful if you already have your 3 doses, because if you have your 3 doses, you're already less likely
Yeah, like the antibodies are
to,
there.
yeah, you know, the protection against infection, that initial infection, does go down over time, but it doesn't go to zero. Um,
Nothing's ever
and
zero in science.
right, right. Uh, and you also still have that, you still have protection against passing it on. So because your body is able to quickly respond to it thanks to that immune memory and clear the virus faster than uh, you would be able to if you were unvaccinated, there's a lower chance that you could pass it on.
The thing that you were just mentioning about herd immunity and infection and how the vaccine protects against that, there does seem to be a misunderstanding with people about what it is exactly that a vaccine does. It seems like a lot of people thought, okay, I got the jab, and sure, like, you had to isolate, or like, not isolate, but avoid risk and contact, like you still had to socially distance for 2 weeks to let the antibodies generate. But a lot of people seem to think that once you got your jab, even if it was just the first one, it meant, okay, great, that's it. So now I'm like not going to catch this virus, which is
Hmm.
incorrect. Because if, and again, like I'm willing to show how kind of ignorant I am about certain scientific things here to also hopefully show anyone who's watching this who is an anti-vax, or at the very least they're vaccine hesitant, that it's okay to be wrong and to ask questions. My understanding of how vaccines work is it's not so much that it like prevents infection so much as it prevents the worst aspects of infection, and how it also prevents the replication and thus spreading to other people. So it's like I see it as more of a speed bump rather than say a brick wall, if that makes sense as an analogy. Am I
Mhm.
more or less on the ball, or am I way off base here?
I think you're more or less on the ball there. Because so again, like I said earlier, it often depends on the virus that we're talking about. If I'm talking about a vaccine for one virus, it's not necessarily going to apply strictly to every virus. So a lot of people, they think vaccination, uh, they might think about polio. Um, and a vaccine for polio, it stops you from getting paralyzed and it stops you from dying. So if we're talking about
You still
polio,
get polio though, right?
yeah, yeah. So if we're talking about polio, which people know you have polio if you get paralyzed, um, if the vaccine is widespread and nobody's getting paralyzed, people will think, oh, no polio. But if you used molecular tests to test people for polio, you would probably find a lot of polio um, following, closely after a vaccination program. You probably wouldn't find much polio in somewhere like the United States where it's been eradicated for a while, but um, in an area where it's endemic, you'd probably find a lot of polio even in vaccinated people. But even in those vaccinated people, they're not getting sick because they were vaccinated. The vaccine is preventing disease. It's not preventing infection.
Right. So there's the
Uh,
distinction there. Okay.
yeah. And the reason for that goes back to kind of we were talking about these antibody levels. Um, those antibody levels are what is going to prevent the infection because the virus is going to come into your body and enter through a mucosal surface, find its niche host cells, and then start replicating. If you have antibodies present, then that initial infection part before it starts replicating is going to be a lot harder for the virus. Uh, so that is what is being prevented shortly following a vaccination.
Okay. All right.
But then those levels are going to decrease. You're going to be left with immune memory, which is what we want. And so then when you encounter the virus, it's probably going to be able to infect you, replicate a little bit. Maybe you'll get some mild headache or fever, something you would barely even notice. And then your immune system would kick in and clear the virus before you suffer severe disease. That's what happens with polio. That's what happens with measles. That's what happens with all these illnesses that we've had childhood vaccinations for a long time that we've more or less dealt with in developed, highly vaccinated nations.
Yeah, and that's
But
also why there's been a push to continue vaccinating in other areas that still haven't quite caught up to other corners of the world. It's an ongoing thing. And unfortunately, now because of the interconnected world and media and everything, now some of these places are also vaccine hesitant for things like polio, like measles. And that's just really unfortunate to see.
it
But that
is.
is like kind of only tangentially related to what we're here for, which is debunking the funk. And there's a sort of like other question because now we've talked a bit about the vaccine. Um, a lot of people are vaccine hesitant because to them the vaccine just kind of supposedly came out of nowhere. Now, I know we already kind of touched on this before, where you said we've known about the coronavirus family for a while, which means that there's already an existing body of research. I also remember
Hmm.
earlier on in the pandemic, like maybe when like we were first hearing about successful trials for vaccines, and people were talking about like, oh, mRNA, possibly
Hmm.
being the successful one that would push through. And someone on the radio that I was listening to on my way into work one day pointed out that this is actually a technology, like the mRNA technology is something we've had a really long time, because to bring it
Hmm.
back to something we talked about at the beginning about AIDS and everything, it was actually hoped that an mRNA vaccine would help address the AIDS epidemic. And so, a lot of people, and I get it, right? All of a sudden, big pandemic, scary things, the government's trying to control and like shut us down, tell me where we can go. It's just like the Soviet Union. And like, I know it's not, but I understand why people feel it's that way.
Yeah.
And then obviously, understandably, all of a sudden, look, we got it done super quick. Here's your new vaccine. I understand reticence about that. So while I may know about, we've had this technology for a long time, it's now very useful in terms of the application for this, which is part of why I was able to get out so quickly. I'm assuming also a lot of people and big money saying we need to get the economy back. So like, let's get something out here that we know will be effective. But what would you say to someone who, maybe doesn't know about this, or even in light of knowing that might still be vaccine hesitant? What would you say to them to kind of assuage some of their fears about the sudden emergence of the vaccine? And like, then as a follow-up, we'll probably get into what's in it, because I know it's not poison, but I think we'll have to address that at some point. But
Uh,
first we should just talk about like, what would you say to them to kind of calm their nerves, for lack of a better term?
I think I would try to just walk them through kind of the process of how it came to be. You know, I would explain how people have been working on the concept of an mRNA vaccine for about 30 years now. And I know that someone who's hesitant might have heard that it takes 20 years to develop a vaccine. And I would tell them it takes more like 30 or 40 years. But thankfully for mRNA vaccines, we have a lot of that basic research done. So, I would ask them, or I could ask you, like, what do you think goes into those 30 years of research, those 30, 40 years where someone, groups are trying to develop a vaccine?
The answer is simple. It's all a conspiracy by big pharma.
How'd you know? No. Um, so a lot of what that involves is basic research. So understanding the pathogen, understanding how the immune system responds to it, understanding what would make a good target for the vaccine. Would a live vaccine work for this pathogen? Can we weaken it and give it to you live? Would that work? Would it be better to introduce like a little piece of it? Uh, okay, which piece? They have to figure all that out. That takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to really, you know, get the funding for those experiments, do the experiments, interpret them, and get them published, and then really convince a pharmaceutical company that, hey, this is a good target and this is something that we should really go for. And then have that pharmaceutical company pick it up. They have to do all the work to like develop it, figure out, the formulation, how to store it, gather all that data for the FDA, send it to them, have them review it. It's such a long, involved process, and so many different groups and people are involved in it. It takes so much money. That's just like a brief idea of what goes into that time.
Yeah, but
So when
unfortunately,
when
oh, sorry, yeah, continue.
yeah, it is a little unfortunate that it takes that much. But fortunately with COVID, we had 30 years of research going into like the basic research going into mRNA vaccine research. it was just, I believe, in the 2010s where some really big milestones were made. Scientists had to figure out. Um, so mRNA is really, really fragile. If you look at it wrong, it'll degrade. Scientists hate working with it in the
Mm.
lab. I hated working with RNA in the lab when I was a graduate student. Super fragile molecule. Um, so one problem in using it as a vaccine would be how do we make it so that the body doesn't just destroy it or it just degrades on its own so fast that it doesn't do anything? That that's a problem because a lot of early experiments they injected animals or people in early trials with this stuff, and there was just no immune response. Like nothing happened.
Mm.
So they had to figure out how do we make this mRNA stable enough that it actually does something, but not indestructible, so that it stays around for longer than it should and does weird stuff. That was figured out in the 2010s. Um, there are really good reviews that I usually like to share that include that work in it. Um, so ways to and ways to deliver it were already um, well established, and the drawbacks of it were tweaked out, and uh, we had a really good like starting point to make something, to make a product. So when COVID came around, all that technology was kind of just sitting there because pharmaceutical companies were still at this point where it's like, oh, we're investing into all these other projects that could address the same problems that mRNA vaccines might be able to address. Uh, so
It was them hedging their bets economically because unfortunately they are big businesses, which we are going to get into in a bit.
yes, so pharmaceutical companies are businesses. They do have to make money, so they do have to make business decisions, and they just didn't see mRNA vaccines as something that's worth investing a lot of money in. But now COVID comes into the picture, and suddenly there's a need for a solution. We have to have something. So governments start pouring a lot of money into these projects to create a vaccine. And so there were lots of different formulations, lots of different approaches to make a vaccine. mRNA vaccines were one of them. mRNA vaccines happen to be the kind of vaccine that you can make the quickest. So that's the option where you could literally have a vaccine to test over the weekend. It's that easy to actually make.
Which
So,
explains why it came about so suddenly. Is on top of having like decades of research already done, you also
mhm,
had something that is actually fairly easy to make.
yeah, yeah, they literally had all the pieces, all the platform ready to go. They just needed the sequence of the virus so that they could, you know, plug a part of that sequence into their platform and then have a vaccine to test.
Yeah,
And that's what
which is
happened.
why it's so weird when I hear stills and people saying we don't know anything about this virus. We haven't sequenced the gene. I'm like, it was one of the
Oh
first
man.
things that happened. Like, come on. I've
Oh
seen
man.
articles like, "Hey, positive news, everyone! In the fight against COVID, we've sequenced the gene." I'm like, "Awesome, good." And people are still
Oh
like, "No,
man.
we haven't." It's like, why? But also
Man.
to one of your earlier points about like walking people through the process, like I agree that that's the right thing to do, but it's so much more complicated by the
It's
ease
hard.
of
Yeah.
misinformation online. Lots of people where they may genuinely want to find out about oh, so like what's in the COVID vaccine, and then something that pops up is a YouTube video or a TikTok or it's a Facebook video about that this is how they're lying to you. You want to know what's really in this virus? It's poison, it's
Yep.
mercury, it's all this stuff. It's designed to kill you and poison you to keep you like subservient. And it's like everyone's still consuming high fructose corn syrup. That's way more damaging to your long term health. Just saying, like it.
Yeah, still smoking.
Yeah, like all the other
Whatever.
terrible, awful things for our health, right? But they're
Yeah.
tasty. I get it. So that is still like I get that it's the right thing, but how do we perhaps steer people to the right sources? Is that a case of like government legislation? I hesitate to say regulating the internet, but like,
Yeah.
what are some potential ideas for how we can better direct people to genuine sources and not someone trying to sell, say, like an anti-vaccine, like healing crystal that keeps COVID at bay? Like, what? How do we steer people who mean well away from the worst people who want to sell them something?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, that's a question that I think about a lot, and I don't think there's an easy answer because listening to what I just said, listening to me drone on about how the process works, how, you know, academia interacts with industry and the FDA and all that stuff, it takes more work to listen to that than it does to listen to,
A
you
5 minute
know,
video.
a 5 minute conspiracy theorist video where they've got it well produced. They're, you know, they have the mysterious spooky music, and they're hitting you with like the genuinely interesting to watch, like, hey, did you know this? And most people, they conspiracy theorists will present it in a way that it's like most people don't know enough to question it, and so but they know enough to think like, oh, I've heard that before, that's interesting. And
Yeah,
so
it strikes
yeah,
that balancing act.
yeah, conspiracy theory videos are very good at what they do. Um, you know,
Unfortunately.
yeah. So it's tough to combat it. And I mean, I try to do my best by making the videos that I make. Um, but ultimately, I think in I think the question I can't answer is, what can the average everyday person do about it? And they can just do their best to be informed themselves. Not necessarily even just on the science, but just like asking questions. If someone says like, "Oh, they developed the vaccine so fast," and then someone could say like, "Well, how fast should they have made it?" And then they might say like, "Oh, 20, 30 years." And say, "Okay, well, what happens in those 10, 30 years, 20, 30 years? What do they need to do?" And then have that conversation. You don't have to know all the scientific details, but maybe through that conversation you'll get their gears turning, and maybe they'll go try to answer the questions for themselves, something like that. That's what I try to do in my interactions with people online. Um, it's what I started trying to do with my live streams that I did with some conspiracy theorists. Um, since my last one, which I did months ago, the only real takers I've had were people that I thought were just trying to boost their own platform or would be complete wastes of time.
Mm.
So it's tough. And also, I have a job and a daughter, and I don't always put the time into organizing those kinds of debates. So it's tough. It's tough to do. I think ultimately scientists just have to get better at communicating. They have to get better at media usage in general. Uh, because, I went to grad school for 5.5 years to get my PhD. That's about average, by the way, for my field. Um, and not once was I required to do any sort of curriculum, classes, or training on talking to the general public. We did a decent amount of like, how do I make my talks better for my peers, for my department? But still, those talks were like, the general public could sit in and they'd be like, "What the hell is this guy talking about?" Like,
Yeah, like there's a lot of
because scientists,
scientific jargon for stuff.
yeah, and we as scientists do that to ourselves. We like kind of isolate ourselves to the point where I was thinking about this when I um was writing my first author paper. I was like writing the abstract, and the abstract has to be like 300 words. You have to jam a bunch of stuff in there, so you have to use all these abbreviations and jargon. And I read it, and I'm like, only like a few
20
hundred
people
people,
will
oh,
read this.
only a few hundred people on the planet could read this abstract and think, "Oh, I know what they're saying. I know what this is talking about." And that sucked to me. I'm like, "This sucks. I'm writing stuff that like the average person can never understand unless they like,
Start
really
studying.
put a lot of time into it or
Yeah.
talk to somebody who wrote it." And that just sucks. But that's what scientists spend most of their time doing. That's what they spend most of their time uh, in terms of like, whatever content they create, their papers, their talks. It's all like very inaccessible to the general public. And at least in my experience, the department I went to, I've talked to other PhDs, other postdocs, other graduate students who go to other departments where their programs are a little better in encouraging their students to, you know, develop those skills of talking to the general public. But in my experience, you know, there was just no emphasis on it. And I think that is fairly common. I don't know if it's the majority, but it's fairly common. And I think it shows in the scientific community where, you know, scientists are just not breaking through like they should. And it's changing a little bit. You're starting to see more scientists on TikTok, more scientists on
I was
Twitter.
about to say, yeah.
Um, but it's not enough, because even Twitter, it's very it's limited. You can write a long thread if you want, but there's a very short character limit per tweet. And it's hard to convey accurate science in tweets. Sometimes I
Yeah.
look back at some tweets that I wrote and I put a lot of thought into it and I'm like, oh God, it's not, but it's not covering these aspects, which might be confusing to some people or misinterpreted, and
I'm
it's
also
just
guilty of
it's hard.
oversimplifying things at times, and then someone will inevitably jump in and say, "Oh, you didn't talk about this," and it's like, I don't want to say yeah because tweet limit, but it's just like okay, thank you for adding to the conversation. Like it's there
Yeah,
now, so okay, cool.
yeah,
But it is frustrating that limit. But your answer there also answered what was going to be a follow up question, which is how do we improve science and or vaccine literacy? Which yeah, just being more on social media and breaking terms down more simply for people because you can say right like like I said earlier, the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually breaks through the blood-brain barrier. Most people would say, okay, so what does that even mean? Like, what's the blood-brain barrier? Why is that important? Why is that relevant? Like, that's obviously going to be something that someone would have to find out. Whereas for a lot of people, and I get it, right? Like, we're all busy. We're just kind of consuming stuff on the go. So if you are a concerned parent or a concerned individual and you are understandably not exactly trustworthy about government and big pharma, which is something I do want to get into in a little bit, I understand why people would not want to suddenly jump at a new vaccine and then have those fears basically confirmed almost immediately due to the algorithm saying, why you shouldn't get the jab. And someone's like, oh, geez, yeah, I didn't realize that. That's terrible. I'm so glad I listened to my gut, right? And that's actually kind of a problem in this
yeah,
case.
yeah. It's so tough because sometimes, because I think about topics that I didn't study for years, like finances. I mean, I don't have a clue about finances. I don't know. I wouldn't know where to
Same.
start to look for advice on like if I need accounting advice. I mean, I'd go to an accountant and ask them, but you can't always just like go ask a scientist something. It's hard
Unfortunately not.
to do that. Um, and so I hate to say like honestly, if you're someone who is like concerned, but you don't have time to like consume content and read papers and listen to scientists and try to sort out which scientist is the good one and which is the bad one, you know, just kind of think for a minute and say like, okay, what's the consensus? I see that some dude went on Joe Rogan and got 40 million downloads and
Yeah.
he's saying this stuff that's scary, but like
Mass
is that the
formation
science?
psychosis.
Yeah, God.
Yeah, I
But
know.
like,
You've done videos on that.
oh yeah, I did one on him. Um,
Yeah.
but you know, if you see something like that and you're concerned, think like, okay, would the vaccine be rolled out and be as internationally supported as it is if the majority of scientists didn't agree that it's safe and effective? And if you're comfortable answering like, yeah, it wouldn't be if that wasn't the case, um, then maybe it's best to just say like, okay, what's the consensus? I'm gonna go with that. And I hate to like say like, okay, just trust the consensus, but that's really probably your best bet if you really can't get into it, if you really can't dedicate the time to have a comfortable understanding of it yourself, because at the end of the day, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are spending every day studying this stuff. They aren't stupid. They they are all asking
They're in the pocket of
questions.
big
They're
pharma,
all
though.
oh man, but they're so not. It's
Yeah,
it's like
I know.
it's crazy
We are
how
going to get into it soon.
yeah, yeah.
No,
It's crazy how cutthroat scientists can be and when it comes to actually having the best scoop, so to speak, having the most interesting data that says everything else is wrong.
I
That's
mean,
like
yeah, because like then you can put your name on that and like get
yeah.
medical patents and stuff. But
Hmm.
if I could also add to that point and also tie it into something you said just like a few minutes ago, you said like if I need accounting advice, I go to an accountant. Um,
Yeah.
for the record, I tend to see myself as like some kind of something's like a narco socialist of some kind. I believe in collective good, but also, questioning things and non hierarchy where needed,
Mhm.
but also respecting people who obviously know what they're talking about. I think there's actually a phrase that some people like to use. It's when it comes to boot making, I defer to the authority of the boot maker. Because yeah, I'm not an expert in everything. I have my expertise, same as you, same as everyone else. So for me, when it came to the vaccine, it wasn't so much about like just trust that the government has my interests at heart, because I've seen before they absolutely do not.
Hmm.
But in this case, it's like, okay, so what are scientists saying? What are governments saying? What are businesses saying? What are various groups that have to work together are saying? And also, generally, like
Hmm.
you said, in kind of like a consensus, it's like what's happening broadly around the world that we can see in real time in terms of reactions, what's working, what's not. So Sweden's whole no, we're not going to have any lockdowns and stuff, that ended up being very bad. New
Hmm.
Zealand's more, and China's like COVID zero approach, and New Zealand's like nearly COVID zero approach seem to be very effective, but also draconian in certain ways. Masking, we found out, masking seems to actually reduce the risk. Okay, everyone in various areas seems to agree on that. So, okay, fine. I don't like it personally, except in winter. Wearing a mask in winter is actually really great
Yeah.
because it keeps your face warm.
Yeah.
But do I enjoy wearing a mask? Absolutely not. But then also for me, on top of like sort of like the consensus and just kind of seeing and pulling from different sources, including some that like are either completely contradictory or slightly contradictory, all in all, it kind of creates a mosaic picture. Not a clear picture for me, but like a mosaic of this seems to be the image and what I should do and how I should respond, especially given that it's like, I obviously would not be able to live with myself if I ended up making my mom, my dad, my sisters, my ex girlfriend, any of my friends, co-workers. I really would struggle to live with myself and not feel incredibly guilty if I got sick, asymptomatically or not, and pass it on to them and they got really sick and got long COVID, or they, in worst case scenarios, died. So that for me as well is like, okay, I will do what I can to keep my community safe, my own personal comfort, whether with like a new vaccine or with mask wearing and stuff like that, be damned. I want to protect the people that I interact with, because I would also like them to do the same for me. That's kind of how respect
Mhm.
works in my mind. um So it's not even that I've had time to read through vast papers. I have seen papers, and I've seen other people like on Twitter, mostly on Twitter, sometimes on Reddit when I see stuff. People will link stuff or share an actually like decent video. That's also how I found your channel. Actually, was in response to the whole mass formation psychosis thing. I saw your debunking that video. I was like, oh, you know what? I'm curious to see this because like I know a lot of people were really delving into that other video, and it was really well done. And like I'm kind of trying to pull from a variety of different sources on a variety of different platforms to kind of create not exactly a clear picture, but a hazy picture of kind of where things are. Which is why even though mask mandates ended a while ago, I'm still wearing a mask to help like reduce transmission as much as possible, and also again to keep family members who are immune compromised as safe as possible and minimize risk and exposure. Because that's kind of what the body of science tells me I should do. In spite of,
Hmm.
oh, you don't have to wear a mask anymore. I'm like, no, you don't have to get, fourth booster shot. It's like, okay, so I'm going to take some of this, take from a little of this, take from a little of this in the interest of safety. That's ultimately the goal. Um,
Hmm.
so, I've skimmed several like medical papers and like papers and like Twitter threads by epidemiologists. But again, it's kind of like I know that I have the privilege to do that sometimes, as opposed to someone
Hmm.
who kind of just has to wake up, get to work for 8, 10, 12 plus hours, and then go home and then do it all again, right? Like I understand that people
Yeah.
don't have that time, and not saying that I even fully had time, but I had more than others to kind of sit with it and figure things out. And so we've kind of danced around it a bit now, but now I do want to get into it because I find that there's also a lot of people who, when I talk about I'm listening to the science, they also say, well, like, why are you just such a shill for big pharma? And for me, and this is kind of why I want to get into big pharma and some other stuff here. For me, I am able to separate science from big pharmaceutical companies. Like, yes,
Hmm.
Monsanto does bad things. Pfizer and Moderna, they basically just want to see profit because we live in a capitalist system.
Hmm.
However, that doesn't mean that every scientist who works for them and who doesn't work for them, and internationally in other countries with other institutes, etc., doesn't mean that they're all part of some giant science conspiracy cabal. So,
Hmm.
I'm for me anyway, I'm able to separate the like, hey, I have my problems with big pharma. Yes, I got their vaccine because they're basically the only people who have the like infrastructure, as it were, to produce that on a grand global scale. That's kind of it. We don't have, a nationalized pharmaceutical lab that can just produce this stuff, right? Like that's kind of the issue. So how would you try and get other people to kind of see it a similar way in terms of science does not equal big pharma and vice versa? Like how can we compartmentalize and separate that for people? Because yeah, I'm no fan of big pharma at all, but a lot of people seem hooked on that as like, but that's how the conspiracy starts. Like that's where they put the microchip or the poison in you. Like it's always something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How would you try and square that circle, as it were?
Yeah. I mean, I would, like you've been saying, first of all, agree with them, say, yeah, Big Pharma's shady. They do they do pretty terrible things sometimes. They sometimes try to cut corners and lie to make profit. But that doesn't mean that we are going to just abandon it altogether. Do you not want people uh, making medicines for you? Do you not want people doing the science to make sure that, your food is safe to eat? I don't think that you would say that we should, you know, not trust them at all. Uh, because then we wouldn't have any medications really. We wouldn't have any medical devices. So many people would just be left to suffer.
I
Um,
mean, again, in like in my ideal fantasy land, I would love to see a system where there isn't a profit motive. It's just, hey, you know what? Let's actually begin research into, whatever it is, solving cancer,
Yeah.
proper, better, newer techniques for tumor treatment and removal, better, more effective vaccines for even, minor illnesses that only affect maybe a couple thousand people around the world. Like all this kind of stuff, I would love to see the profit motive completely removed. But I recognize we don't currently live in that world. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like you have to work with what you have right now, unfortunately. So like,
Yeah.
sure, I'm not 100% trustworthy of the government, even on the best of days, and I don't trust big pharma. At the same time, given the current situation, what's available to us, I have to make compromises with my utopian ideals, I guess you could say.
hmm Yeah. And so I guess the short of that, uh, I would say, yeah, I don't trust big pharma either. I know that they do shady stuff. That's why I make it so that I don't need to trust them. I can just look at the data, and then I can, because I've been in this field for so many years, I can read the studies, I can interpret the data, and I can look for corroborating data in the literature. Because with every paper you read, you can look at the authors, you can look at how many people contributed to the study. And usually you can look at the named authors, and usually there are a handful of other scientists behind it who did work for it, but not enough to like get mentioned as an author. Um, the point is, there are lots and lots of people that are going to be involved in doing these actual experiments and gathering actual data and putting in time out of their lives to write papers so that others can read about it. And I I don't think many people would honestly commit to the idea that all of them are just lying and in it for money, especially when you learn that probably most of those scientists earn fixed salaries and still work like, you know, 10-hour days, which is a toxic part of working in science, of course, but that's another topic. These people are just not in it for money, you know, uh, especially academic scientists. Pharma scientists, they make more money, but even then, even in a situation where a pharmaceutical company is in this capitalist society and needs to make money in order to survive, if they don't make good products, if they don't make good, safe products, they're gonna they're not going to be around long,
Yeah, because the
right?
consumer would not trust it with their themselves, their children, and that buyer beware, and so they just stop buying it.
Yeah. It is in the pharmaceutical company's best interest to make a safe and effective product because not only do they want to have that product to sell, but they have competitors who want to do the same thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
if their product is not as safe as another company's, the other company is going to win. And then that company that didn't have the safest product is going to be out billions of dollars because that's how much money it takes to get a drug to clinical trials and approved. It's a massive amount of work, time, and money to do that. So it's a big investment. It's in their best interest to make sure that it works, you know. And yes, you can read past stories of like the opioid epidemic is a good one to go to because situation where uh, doctors were actually bribed or misled in order to prescribe more or misprescribe painkillers,
Although
and
to be
that
fair,
was a
that
whole
is mostly an American problem in that regard,
yes,
because of like for-profit healthcare here in Canada. Like, yeah, there's still the cost for pharmacare, but doctors didn't have as much of an incentive to do that. And oftentimes, I've even had doctors say you can just buy like the the store brand like core ingredient label, so like not the fancy brand name label. It'll cost you
mhm,
way less, and it effectively does the same thing. I'm like, noted. So yeah,
yeah,
I know that
yeah,
that's a distinction that I should remind people is that while not a uniquely American problem, is mostly an American problem.
Yeah, that's yeah. I'm talking very American centric, because we Americans do that. But uh, that is another thing to keep in mind, that a lot of these conspiracy theories only work in a more American centric situation. Um, because in societies where healthcare is less profit driven, it doesn't really work. But it's
We
still
still have our
the evidence.
conspiracy crazies up here. I've seen your videos of
Of,
the ones in Australia, so
oh yeah.
unfortunately, like it has spread to a lot of
hmm
places.
hmm
Ugh.
But a lot of it is inspired by um, American uh, spreaders of conspiracy theories. Like, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is very prolific. Joseph Mercola, very prolific. Del Bigtree. All these guys are Americans who have these very large internet platforms, and they just spew shit out to the internet, and people eat it up. Um, so
Unfortunately,
I,
yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those people are inspired by these American um, misinformation spreaders. Um, but yeah, it's important to acknowledge that these things are real in science. That um, there are other motives that can be in play. Um, there are mistakes that can be made, but that's why, it kind of goes back to, how do you know whether or not something is safe? You know, because if you acknowledge that these things happen, you're either going to reject all of it, like many conspiracy theorists do, or you're going to take a little bit more of a complicated approach and say, okay, how am I going to figure out what's safe and what's not? And if you don't have a system for doing that in your own life, then, you know, what does that really get you? And I guess, yeah, it goes back to the system of, you do have to listen to the experts at some point if you're not willing to put in the work yourself.
And also listen to more than one expert.
Yeah, yeah, the experts, like, you gotta make sure that you're not just listening to the Joe Mercola who is writing another article on his website that sells crap supplements that are overpriced. Um,
Ugh.
uh,
Yeah,
I,
no,
I
I
I
mean,
hope I'm not rambling too
no,
much, but
no, 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 but like, just like the whole supplement thing, it's just like, it reminded me of, Joe Mercola, Joe Rogan, Alex Jones, like
yeah,
all the people online, like, like Gwyneth Paltrow and the whole Goop stuff. It's like, folks, there is such a thing as like medicinal plants that help, but they're also not going to cure cancer or remove your tumor, right? Like for me,
yeah,
it's a gradient thing. Like, sure, like ginger is actually good for alleviating stomach pain, like gas bloating, stuff like that. It's a good natural medicine for things like that. It doesn't fucking fix stomach cancer or prevent me projectile vomiting from a virus. It helps after I've gotten
unfortunately,
some
yeah,
of it, right? So, like, when I'm in recovery, oh yeah, finally, once I can drink liquids again, I'll have some ginger tea. But before that, I usually either need some kind of medicine if it's especially bad, or I just have to sit in pain for at least a 24-hour period and get it all out of my system. So, for me, just a single supplement is not actually an answer entirely. Like
hmm
it could be part of a broader system of health, right? So like eat healthy, try and do a bit of exercise when and where you can, or if you have a really active job, then that's fine. Um, Try and sleep at least a decent amount. I know not everyone gets 8 hours. Like my body refuses to get 8 solid hours. I get like
yeah,
6, maybe 7 if I'm lucky. But apparently, according to my body, that's just what it needs to keep chugging along.
hmm
So like there's lots of different things we can do, but at the same time, medicine is there for a reason when our diet and medicinal plants and stuff can only cut it so far. But a lot of people have put an over reliance on this kind of stuff, especially in the wake of the pandemic, because again, understandably, due to vaccine hesitancy or just trusting in their own, I am healthy enough. And it's like, yeah, you're healthy, but it is a new novel virus, right? So
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
if it was just like, oh, there's a new flu strain going around, okay, well, crap. And like, okay, I didn't get the flu vaccine this year. Like, I've just been too busy. And then, crap, I got the flu and it knocked me on my ass for a few days, but I got over it. It's not like, oh, new virus came into town and we don't have anything to currently treat it. Like, it's all so different and complex. But you have mentioned several of these misinformers online, like Joe Mercola, and I also mentioned Joe Rogan. What is it with Joe's apparently? But
I don't know.
yeah, it's,
They're just average Joes, man. They're so relatable.
hey, there you go. And whatever his face is, the dude who did the whole like mass formation psychosis thing. Um,
Yeah.
so now I do actually want to talk a bit more about your YouTube channel and how it came about. You said you've been doing this for just over 2 years now. So did you
Hmm.
start this before the pandemic, or you very much was like, oh, the pandemic's here, time for me to shine? Like, what's your YouTube origin story?
I started just before the pandemic really started. So,
Okay.
um, I think it was in December, December of
Would have been, yeah,
2019
it would have been 2019.
that that I decided that I was finally going to like make a YouTube channel because I always kind of wanted to.
Okay.
Um, because, you know, part of what kept me interested in science was this kind of like education through debunking kind of approach to it. Because, I used to believe some conspiracy theories. I
Like,
used to,
share with us. Come on now.
I mean, I thought that the big one I believed was that 9/11 was an inside job. Uh, that theory just sucked me in when I was younger, and it just totally trapped me. I was totally obsessed with it. But then I also, started to believe things like there was a hidden cancer cure or um, these weird new. I got into like the new age biology uh, crap. Um,
Oh, is that the stuff with
and
like the Anunnaki and stuff like that?
no, like the new age biology, like I'm going to meditate and I'm going to be perfectly healthy. Um,
Ah, okay, okay, gotcha.
that
Okay,
kind of thing.
yeah.
Um, so, I was very susceptible to that stuff. Um, this was probably like high school. Um, and then I started, you know, becoming more serious about science, and I slowly, over the period of I think a few months, uh, left those ideas behind me. So that was a whole process. But part of what helped me were um, science communicators on YouTube. I thought that was so cool that there were scientists that were taking the time to make videos to address this stuff. And then I would get really into it and I'd be like, okay, well, I found this other conspiracy theory. What's the answer to that? And I would
Okay, so
learn a
then
lot
you're
of
just going
stuff that,
around seeing different debunkings. Okay.
yeah, and I would learn a lot of stuff that I um, don't think I would have learned otherwise. Uh, because conspiracy theorists often try to latch on to very obscure, weird things, and even like partway through college, when I had left those conspiracy ideas behind, and I was learning more and more about um, molecular and cellular biology, I'd hear things from an anti-vaccine argument and think, that sounds completely wrong, but I don't know the details. And so I'd look it up, and I'd have to read up on that topic to understand like why it's wrong. Um, so I loved it. I loved that educating through debunking kind of approach. And because I had, discovered a lot of scientists who were doing that stuff on YouTube through that process, I thought, oh, it would be fun one day to like make my own videos. Um, so then, December 2019, I was kind of coming to like the tail end of my PhD, and um, I had done a lot of extra stuff outside the lab to like learn about science communication, how to communicate science to politicians, how to communicate science to children, to the general public. And I'm like, okay, I've tried all these things and I want to do something that like I want to like apply it all to what I want. Um, and I just decided YouTube channel. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna pull the trigger. I'm gonna have like 1,000 subscribers at most. I'm going to have a really small little community and I'm going to be able to interact with people in the comments section. I'm going to be able to like really uh exercise this kind of passion I have for science communication. Um because I knew I wasn't going to get a job in science communication. They're just those jobs, one, pay nothing, and two, are very few.
And like you gotta eat, right?
Yeah, yeah, I've got a daughter now. I have to have a decent paying job.
Yeah.
Having a, making like 45K a year wasn't gonna be great after having gone to school for 10 years.
Yeah, fair enough.
Um,
Like, hey, this is still more than I
so
make, though. Haha.
shit, sorry.
No, no, hey, no,
But
it's fine. Like, I get it.
but
That is a living wage where I am, though. So like, that's
okay.
okay. But it's still like just barely a living wage, though. It's like I'm
Yeah.
on the edge.
Yeah, it can be tough,
Hmm.
depending on where you live. But um
Ontario.
yeah, I just pulled the trigger and I was like, I'm gonna make YouTube videos. I had already known about like Del Bigtree, who's basically like the Alex Jones of anti-vaxxers. He'll do like all this wacky stuff where he like pours a big bag of rice on his desk and he's screaming about, look at all these viruses in the world. Like just wacky stuff, man. Like just so weird. And I'm
So
like, this will be
it's like
fun to make.
you're literally just trying to scare people, right? It's like look at all this. It's like
Yeah,
sir, that's rice. And like yes, we
yeah,
know like I have more of my body is made of bacteria and stuff rather than me. Like yeah, existence is kind of horrifying when you think about it, dude. Like this isn't anything new.
yeah. These are basic concepts, but he's like just so wacky. And I'm like, this will be fun to make videos about. So that's what I did. Like if you go all the way back to my first few videos where my camera was terrible, my microphone was non-existent, and my hair was short. Um,
Boo! I like the fro.
thanks, yeah. They were pretty terrible videos, but hey, you got to start somewhere. And but that's the kind of stuff I was covering. And then COVID became a thing, and I think like one of my first 10 videos was about COVID. But I thought, I'm gonna just stick to like anti-vaccine stuff because I didn't expect COVID to take off as much as it did. We only really have history to draw from, and I thought it was going to be more like SARS-1, where it spreads and then fizzles out.
I think a
Um,
lot of people were counting on that, which is why a lot of people initially told me, "Oh yeah, this like it'll be like what happened in Toronto. We got a few months of dealing with it, and probably more localized. Like okay, sure, it's spreading in a few cities, but we got this under control, right?" And I don't know. There's a part of me. There's just something different about how fast it seemed to be spreading, and especially with like asymptomatic transmission. I was like, "This is a problem, and we're going to have to deal with this for a while."
yeah, once the asymptomatic transmission was a thing, um, well, it's asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, was the thing. Um, Once that was really uncovered, then I was like, oh shit,
I like
that's
how for
different.
those of us who like knew a little bit of stuff, as soon as it was, oh, it's spreading asymptomatically. Fuck.
Yeah, I was like, oh, that's different. Because with SARS-1, it made you really sick, before you could really be out and about transmitting it. Um, that's a big reason why it just didn't spread very well, why it fizzled out. But SARS-2, that that pre-symptomatic thing, asymptomatic, that's totally different. That was when I was like, oh crap. And then we got to March and it was still spreading, and I'm like, okay, this is different.
When I saw that there were places like shutting down, and like emergency wards being overwhelmed, I'm like, oh, okay, it's finally happening. People have been warning that we're overdue for a pandemic, and so it was always in the back of my mind. And then when I
Hmm.
started to see like the first murmurs of like lockdowns and it's asymptomatic transmission and like hospital wards are being filled up, I'm like, okay, it's here now, unfortunately.
Yeah,
um yeah,
yeah.
and it's funny you mentioned March because at that point in time, I had just finished a new job training program that
Hmm.
was in the at an airport doing like baggage handling, like dealing with all the stuff outside of the airplane to get it ready for flight or when a flight is arriving and then offloading everyone. It was all those different
Hmm.
jobs. It's all tied together. It was called like ramp attendant or something like that. And I did like that job, but basically, like when I started, sure, as the airport's doing fine, and then by the time I finish and pass the program in March, it's like there's two flights a day, and the airport is
Mm.
dead. I was like, wow, like this is
Yikes.
unreal. I've never seen anything like this before. Like it was extremely surreal and disconcerting to see that.
Yeah,
And I also saw the writing on the wall of like, I know I literally just got this job, but I don't see it lasting long. And sure enough, it didn't. And then I
yeah.
had got a
Oh, that
different job. So then
sucks.
when they invited me back, it's like, well, I already have this new job and it's full time already, and they pay me more. So sorry, bye.
Mm. Hey, well, I'm glad that worked out for you.
Yeah, I
But
got a job with very similar benefits, not exactly the same, but like still pretty good benefits, everything considered.
mhm,
I got full time after like 6 months, which was really good, and
that
it's less dangerous and it paid more. So I was like, I did like the other job and had some other really nice perks and benefits, but this
all
for me is
wins.
like I'm making more and it's safer and I'm already full time, so gonna stick with that because again, right, like you said earlier, I gotta eat, I got bills to pay.
Hmm. Yeah, that man, but yeah, you said surreal, and that that's kind of what it was, how I remember it too. Um, yeah, I was still in grad school, and I we kept having this conversation where it's like, man, this virus is spreading a lot, you know? Maybe they're going to shut down the university. And I kept saying, me and a couple other people kept saying, no, they're not going to shut down the university. That's not going to happen. And then, like, yeah, like March was here, and we started hearing talk of that happening. And it's like, oh my God, this is really serious.
Yeah.
And yeah, but there was so much uncertainty in those first few months. It was crazy. Um,
Well, because we no one knew, right? And that's a
oh,
fair defense of unfortunately a lot of the ignorance, at least at that time. Now,
yeah,
obviously, it's a lot more inexcusable. But given what people knew at the time, it's kind of more understandable that people thought, oh, okay, it's probably going to be like SARS again. We've kind of ran this rodeo before. We'll do like certain lockdowns, begin contact tracing, prep some places for it. Maybe it'll affect just like a few cities internationally. We should be fine. We're like, okay, all right, fine. Okay, so Wuhan, and then like, okay, Italy, and so like somewhere in America, like big airports. We get it. We're like, we'll just be very careful. And then it was like, oh wait, no, this is different. So
like,
I
oh, this is,
understand. I
yeah.
think it's more excusable back then than it is to still wallow in ignorance now, given everything that we know about the virus, like the fact that it is a cardiovascular disease, which is why some people who were otherwise perfectly healthy died of heart attacks or of strokes or blood clots because it's a cardiovascular disease. It's not the fucking flu.
Yeah, it's definitely not the flu. And yeah, I mean, also the uncertainty is what spawned a lot of conspiracy theories because one big like um common theme in conspiracy theorists is they have this unrealistic expectation of what science should be. They think that science should have the answers, but if they don't, then that's like immediately jump on that and say, "Oh, science doesn't know anything."
It's
The
like science
early,
is always seeking to improve itself.
yeah, and the early months of COVID was genuinely we did not know much. We did not know for sure like how dangerous this virus was. We did not know for sure how it spreads. We did not know for sure if we could make a vaccine against it. Like nobody knew
Yeah.
for sure any of that stuff. Um, and so in in the space of all that uncertainty, conspiracy theories fill that space. Um, and that was just unfortunate. Um,
But it gave you a good amount of content to use
I
for your
was gonna
channel.
say, yeah, the channel, it was very like weird the timing because again, it was just something that was in my head, like, oh, I want to do this one day, I want to do this one day, and then I got to this point where I was just like, let me do it, just do it, it'll be fun. Um, and then COVID happens, and I'm like, well, this is interesting.
Right
Eh,
place, right time.
I guess so, yeah. And now I'm in a place where, um, I have a stable job that I'm fortunate enough still allows me enough freedom outside of that job to dedicate time to making videos. And so the misinformation is still raging on. There are lots of new names that have popped up in these anti-vaccine slash COVID denial conspiracy circles, and I'm just going through them, uh, either one person or one piece of content at a time, and I'm enjoying it. I get to I'll read about I'll do like the relevant reading for a video during the week, sometimes at work during downtime, and then uh, on the weekend after the kid goes to sleep, I just make a video and edit it when I can and upload it. And it really is it's cathartic in a way because the misinformation is frustrating. And so it's a way for me to like feel like I'm doing something about it. Um, and it's also just like uh, fun and educational for me because I still learn through debunking. I genuinely don't think I would have learned as much as I have learned in the past 2 years of doing this channel if I wasn't
That's fair.
continually debunking these new ideas. Because even still, there are claims that come up where I'm like, okay, I need to like actually look into the details of this to determine whether or not it's correct or how accurate it is.
Yeah, because like
And then I learn
someone could
and
be
then I
sharing
learn
something that's
things.
partially correct, but it depends
Yeah.
on like everything else that goes into it.
Yep. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I do like about your channel. Like I know I already talked about the what was it, like Robert Malone who did the
Yeah.
uh, mass formation psychosis or whatever.
Hmm.
But then I also saw like you did a few about some of the stuff that was going on in Australia. So it's not
Hmm.
just strictly for anyone who might be watching this and wondering. Your channel is not strictly just American focused. There's a lot of American voices, but you're just there debunking all the funk related to this stuff, and of course, right now, COVID being the big thing. I'm assuming in the
Hmm.
future though you'll change that to like whatever else comes up that needs debunking once COVID finally is in our rearview mirror.
I I really want to get back to covering Del Bigtree. I think he's so just batshit insane. It's so fun to like I mean it makes me a special kind of person to say this, but it's so fun to watch his content and be like, man, this is just wacky. I know some people are like they cringe, they can't watch it,
I,
they think it's just like, oh God, get me out. And but I'm just like,
I'm like that
oh man,
sometimes. Yeah.
I'm like, oh man, this is just This is good stuff. This is this is good wacky stuff.
Well, you know what?
So
I'm
yeah.
glad you're enjoying yourself because, like, I'll admit, like sometimes the videos that you put out, they're fantastic, right? I love learning with you, right? And I share them where I can, on Reddit, sometimes in like the replies on Twitter, mostly on Facebook though is where I see the most
Mm.
misinformation. So it's like, okay, someone's saying this, quick, go to debunk the funk. Oh yeah, of course you have a video on this already. All right, copy, paste, suck it, Karen. Like that's basically
That's
what I do. Um,
so cool.
no, but admittedly though, like through watching this, because obviously I do want to watch through it so that if someone's like, I'm not watching that, it's like listen, and so I can at least parse some of the information out.
Hmm.
And admittedly, not gonna lie, man, sometimes it is hard to get through some of these people with what they're saying. There's some stuff that at first seems kind of like innocent, or other times it just kind of seems like, oh, I didn't know that about them. That seems fair. And then you
Hmm.
say, well, actually, they're kind of lying about this. They weren't actually the one doing this, or they weren't the only one doing this work. In fact, they don't even appear onto like this point in the lecture, or they're not even credited. Like you add so much more to that, which is like, oh, I didn't even know or would have thought of that or recognized that. So thank you for that. But then sometimes just having to watch through some of these people be so incredibly ignorant, I'm like, oh god, like just get me to the
Yeah.
debunking part. I can't
Yeah,
watch
it's it
this ignoramus much longer. Oh god, so like there is good payoff, but for me, it's definitely been many a face palm of the people you're debunking in your videos, though. Not gonna lie.
yeah, I understand. It can be a cringe fest.
Yeah, that's a good way of
But
putting it.
yeah, but I mean I enjoy it. I do have a limit though. I just finished reviewing Robert F. Kennedy's book about Anthony Fauci.
RFK Jr. because the actual
Yes.
RFK is dead.
Did I say junior?
You didn't.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
new conspiracy.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., not the zombie.
Well, there's that.
His
There's
book.
what that QAnon conspiracy where they thought that JFK would come back, or JFK Jr. would come
Yeah,
back and
that was
endorse Donald Trump.
hilarious.
So like we can add
Hilarious.
to that. It's like now it's also the other Junior, RFK Jr.
So hilarious.
Oh
Well, yeah, I
god.
mean Robert F. Kennedy definitely has come back from the dead. He's totally a zombie, but he's not writing books. So his junior wrote this book about Anthony Fauci, and I was reviewing it on my channel, originally chapter by chapter, and I got
Like 4 chapters
um
deep, I think. Last I checked.
uh s- I got to it was when I got to chapter 6, I think, when I'm like, this is too terrible. This is too painful to read and review, because I could read it just fine and just like facepalm and underline stuff and go on. But then when I had to actually sit down and say, okay, there's like a pile of shit in front of me. Like what am I gonna pick to cover? That was the hardest thing about making those videos, because it's just every page is just garbage, garbage, garbage. And I'm like,
Oh yeah.
I have to pick stuff, or else these videos are each going to be like 2 hours long. Um, and so I'm just like, you know, I think I've proven my point. This book is awful. Let me just like lump the rest of it into one video, wrap up my thoughts, and then move on, because it's just
Yeah.
uh, too much crap. So that's where that went. Um, that's done, and now I'm going back to reviewing videos. Um, and the next one is going to be a guy who does like these medical lectures on YouTube, and he's pretty popular among conspiracy theorists. But he's one of those people who covers just enough science to make it look like he knows what he's talking about, but the points that he makes are actually completely not connected at all, but he's trying to connect them.
So it's like
And
a grade 8 science project, basically.
yeah,
Okay,
totally.
cool. I
So
say,
yeah.
I should get off my high horse. I didn't do anything more than grade 10 science, right? But yeah,
But you're still like doing the work to read. You probably have read more scientific papers than most Americans.
Most
So
Canadians too. Let's be honest.
I can't speak for that, but sure.
I generally speaking, yes, here in Canada, by and large, we have more faith in science and government. Obviously, that has been eroded through the pandemic. It was also under erosion before, just due to the economic pressures of reality that weren't fundamentally
Mm,
being addressed by either of the two main parties that tend to form power up here. It's just that
makes
everything's
sense.
been accelerated to a worse point because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, and I guess we should probably start wrapping up on this point actually. Because based on all of this, so all the mountains of misinformation, all the questions and stuff that we were going over about vaccine hesitancy and misinformation, between all of this and the worst thing of society, people saying, "Oh, you can't put the poison in me." Like we had the freaking Freedom Convoy up here in Canada that
Yeah,
was occupying the downtown of our capital city, all over vaccine mandates, even though again most of the mandates were scheduled to end in like a few weeks to a month after that point anyway. It's just oh
yeah,
no, we'll just advance it a bit further. Like it's all just so ridiculous. And even other just very simple things like masking up in hospitals and stuff has been pulled back. So it does feel, especially for those who are still trying to do the right thing and to try and keep their communities safe and try and not catch a terrible, awful disease, um, it can seem rather hopeless at times. So I'm wondering if maybe you have, some kind of hope or optimism that you can offer to people for, the next months and years ahead of us as we, do begin to finally move on from this once in a lifetime pandemic.
totally. Yeah. Um, I think again, looking at it in a historical context helps. And again, I'll reference polio. So, with polio vaccination, when that rolled out in the 1950s, there was obviously a big campaign to get people vaccinated. But it took decades for vaccination levels to reach the point where it was like, you know, 70, 80, 90% people vaccinated. Even though, you know, now we have a lot more disinformation, a lot more means for people to spread disinformation. Uh, and it seems like there are just all these loud people who are refusing all the science that is offered to them. Uh, Despite all of that, you know, the vaccines have been out for what, uh, about a year and a half now?
I think like just over a year, but no, I guess actually it would be a year and a half because 3 doses and all that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And we have countries that have reached 70, 80, 90% vaccinated.
I
Um,
think we're one of those actually.
the
Yeah.
Yeah, the 3 doses lagging a little behind, but it's getting there. It's rising. Uh, and so I think that's encouraging that, you know, we have been able to reach such high levels of vaccine uptake so quickly. Um, I think now the real challenge will be to, one, get more people to take their third shot, and two, get these vaccines to uh, other countries around the world. Because as long as there are those populations of unvaccinated people, COVID is going to keep coming in waves in those populations. And as those waves progress, it's going to mutate further and further, possibly a future variant or new strain that might require a vaccine update. And we don't want to go through that. Like, just stop. Um,
Yeah, people are already hesitant enough. You have to tell them, oh, time for a new vaccine. It's like, come on now. That's
yeah,
going to be very hard for people to swallow.
yeah. So you know, I don't want to get too disjointed here, but I said earlier, you know, you asked me about predicting how many shots are we going to need, and right now, 3 doses looks like that's enough to neutralize and protect against all variants that we know of. But 1 year, 2 year, 3 years down the road, when half the world still is not vaccinated, how much will SARS-CoV-2 have been able to spread through those populations and replicate and evolve into something that uh, these vaccines don't cover? You know, that's going to be a problem. Uh, so getting the vaccine to countries that don't have it is really important. And I think that's a goal that we can hope for, advocate for in any way we can. And I think that's a source of hope, combined with the fact that we already have such high vaccine uptake in most countries that have the vaccine available to it. So, you know, the dissenters, the anti-vaxxers, the idiots, the plain old morons, they're not going to go away. They're always going to be there monetizing their disinformation and uh, not caring about who it hurts. They're always going to be there.
Reacting out of fear.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't blame the person who you know, goes to work 9 to 5 and then, you know, sees a bit of disinformation and reacts out of fear and doesn't want to get vaccinated. I don't blame that person. I blame the idiot who is actively spreading disinformation on a platform, making money off of it, pretending to have expertise, all that stuff. Those are the people I blame, and those are the people that I will call morons and not have sympathy for. Um, they're not going away, but we can try to educate the people who are on the fence. We can take hope in the fact that so many people have already gotten vaccinated, that most people have not fallen for that garbage. And we can work toward the goal of getting the vaccine to more people who need it and people who want it, because those countries that don't have good access to vaccines, they want them, because usually those are countries that are not very well developed. Usually countries that are not really well developed already have endemic infectious diseases that they see every day. They know how harmful they can be, as opposed to a more privileged nation that generally doesn't have that problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we have things we can work towards, and we have things we can be proud of. So, despite all the idiots, there's a lot of good in this.
They're loud, but thankfully, so far they don't seem to be winning.
Right, right. They're not winning, because most people have been vaccinated.
All right. Well, I think that's a good reminder of the bigger picture, as it were. So with that, Dr. Dan Wilson, thank you so much for being here. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun talking to you, man.
Hey, likewise. Hi, Bother Brigade. Thank you once again for tuning into yet another episode of Progressive Profiles. It was a ton of fun talking to Dr. Dan Wilson. I strongly encourage everyone to go check out his channel. All the links for his socials will be in the description down below, including, of course, contact information. He has willingly given this, so that if anyone does have questions, comments, concerns about, vaccines, vaccine misinformation, debunking other, crazy conspiracy theories from the right and stuff like that, you have an opportunity to go and talk to him and actually, talk through these things, which, as he pointed out, is kind of necessary to really starting to push back against a lot of the terrible, awful misinformation that's going on out here. But it was a great and unfortunately necessary conversation. But please let me know, what your favorite part of it was in the comment section down below. And if you want to keep this show going, and if you also kind of just like me and all the botherations that I post about fairly regularly, then there's a Patreon that you can maybe go and support if you want to. I'm not forcing anyone. It is kind of tough times right now, so I completely understand. But with that being said, massive shout out to my patrons who are continuing through thick and thin to support me in whatever this is. So shout out to you, you wonderful, amazing creatures. But the unfortunate reality, though, of this time is that it's been 2 years and we still have to deal with COVID misinformation and the denial that there's still an ongoing pandemic. And that's what's bothering me today.